Good morning, everyone. I'd really like to use this opportunity to share with you a short article entitled Solving Global Problems Requires Global Cohesion. I wrote this very recently with input from a broad range of colleagues with exceptionally rich and diverse expertise. My co-authors on the paper include our host today, John, Carlos Alvarado Quesada, who recently served a full term as president of Costa Rica, Cristiana Figueres, who, as you know, I'm sure, is the celebrated climate activist who spearheaded the Paris Agreement of 2015, Sir Peter Gluckman, who's president of the International Science Council and chief science advisor to multiple prime ministers over a 10-year period in New Zealand. And finally, my postdoc, Lucas Reinhardt, who's basically a behavioral economist who's been working with me on empirical studies exploring various potential pathways to global cohesion. Now, a good deal of the paper is about how our evolved psychology has been managed and harnessed over the millennia. This is a theme that is really central to the book that John has very kindly mentioned, and I believe there are flyers circulating around the room. And the idea is that central to this book really is the idea that although our ancestors over thousands of years have managed to harness our evolved psychology in ways that have enabled us to scale up cooperation, to build ever larger and more complex societies, a lot of those solutions to the problems posed by our evolved psychology are failing us today. And that is leaving us in a very dangerous situation. But the book is really offering a very optimistic view. In fact, Scott and I were talking last night about how whether or not my optimism is justified. And that's something I really want us to discuss as a group today. Our plan is to submit the paper I'm going to present to you to Foreign Affairs, ideally quite soon. But I'd really like to get feedback from people in this room. If there isn't time for you to express your thoughts in the discussion, I hope you'll email me or contact me by some other method afterwards, because I'd really like your feedback on it. Okay, so let me share this paper with you. For the first time in the history of humankind, failure to establish effective forms of peaceful cooperation to address global problems poses an existential threat to our species. In the past, humans were able to plunder the world's resources, to conquer each other's lands, to enslave, exploit, and colonize the vanquished, and carry out mass killings as a way of consolidating wealth and power. But it's now clear that there is a limit to these forms of extraction, oppression, and conflict as a basis for the advancement of human civilization. The way that we're using the Earth's resources is leading to a spiraling climate crisis. Rapid changes in communications technologies are producing increasingly polarized and unstable societies, and the lethality of weaponry, from cyber threats to nuclear warheads, raises the spectre of eventual breakdown in global systems and perhaps even mutually assured destruction. We can all readily imagine the forms of international cooperation, technological innovation, legislation, and institutional reform that would be needed to address all these problems. We can probably also pinpoint the types of structural change required to achieve net zero economies, to empower the institutions needed to address global challenges, particularly in the security space, or to redistribute wealth, to facilitate trade and eliminate poverty. What's far harder to imagine, and therefore commonly neglected, is how we motivate the people of the world and the leaders of their countries to commit to bringing about these forms of radical change in the teeth of opposition from powerful vested interests. Leaders may support ambitious commitments at international gatherings, such as at the UN General Assembly or G20 summits, but all too often backpedal in response to pressure from domestic stakeholders. States worldwide are currently becoming more internally divided and less able to cooperate internationally, owing in part to forms of populism that exploit this decline and forms of nationalism that amplify it. However, this is by no means inevitable. Past leaders of conviction, such as Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King, were able to persuade others to support visionary policies that were initially unpopular or seemingly impossible to implement. At the Centre for the Study of Social Cohesion here in Oxford, we're trying to establish how best to foster the kinds of leadership and the kinds of cohesion needed to motivate action on global challenges. The human capacity to solve collective action problems with the help of suitable leaders has a long and complex evolutionary history. Like many other cooperative species, ranging from eusocial insects to mammals, humans have biologically evolved adaptations for cooperation in groups. These include psychological mechanisms that lead us to favour cooperation within groups and to derogate out groups, to recognise ostracism threats when they're present, and to adopt behaviours that mitigate risks of exclusion. And even under certain circumstances, people have an evolved psychology that leads them to sacrifice themselves to protect other members of the group. These pan-human psychological adaptations evolved over millions of years to enable humans to flourish in small foraging groups. However, in a very short space of time in evolutionary terms, human groups have grown exponentially larger, from bands of hunter-gatherers comprising scores of individuals to complex states and empires unifying millions of citizens, and nowadays exceeding the 1 billion threshold, of course, in the cases of India and China. This rapid increase in the scale of human cooperation has its roots in the discovery of agriculture around 10,000 years ago, and the emergence of the first states just a few thousand years after that, followed by a process of cultural group selection in which ever larger military powers spread by means of political domination and economic exploitation. The causal drivers of this process of socio-political evolution are becoming increasingly well understood as a result of the statistical analysis of patterns in global history that are enabling scientists to test competing hypotheses against direct evidence gathered from large samples of past societies studied by archaeologists and historians. This prior research in the cognitive and evolutionary sciences, which my research centre has helped to lead and to shape, is providing increasingly detailed insights into the mechanisms by which cooperation can be scaled up to a global level, if supported by the right kinds of leadership. For humans to live in larger and more complex societies, our cognitive and emotional systems, which originally evolved for life in small face-to-face groups, had to be modified and extended to solve collective action problems through the peaceful interaction of strangers living in much, much larger and denser, in many cases, urban settlements. At the Centre for the Study of Social Cohesion, we've established a global collaborative network of evolutionary theorists, data scientists, experimental psychologists, historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists to collectively develop an integrated framework for explaining how that scaling up process came about. In ancient hunter-gatherer societies, the strongest forms of social cohesion were based on a form of group alignment known to psychology as identity fusion, whereby the personal self becomes fused with a group identity. The fusion mechanism is rooted in feelings of shared essence. That is, the conviction that something essential to one's personal identity is also a defining characteristic of the group. A particularly common example of this process is to be seen in psychological kinship rooted in what's known as phenotypic matching, where people who look or sound or smell like me are assumed to share some kind of biological essence, often conceptualized as being in the person's blood or in their bones or something like that, and are thought to be inherited from common ancestors. Those kinds of mechanisms, which came about through kin selection, have been shown in many other species to motivate extremely strong forms of cooperation, ranging from the high-risk predator distraction tactics of birds that feign broken wings to protect their fledglings, to the willingness to forego reproductive opportunities in favour of more dominant individuals in social species like wolves, for example. In the case of humans, studies show that fusion based on perceptions of shared biological essence underlie fusion in kin groups of various sorts. Unlike other species, though, humans also associate their personal essence with unique autobiographical experiences. That is to say, self-defining events that make a person distinct from anyone else. When personally transformative events of this kind are shared with others, when they become group-defining as well as personally defining, this can drive feelings of fusion in much the same way as perceptions of shared biological essence can drive feelings of fusion. Moreover, studies with large samples of twins have shown that shared life experiences drive fusion with a sibling independently of the effects of shared biology. Evolutionary modelling, supported by evidence from psychological experiments, suggests that fusion based on shared experiences evolved in conditions of strong intergroup competition associated with harsh environments, what you might call us versus nature contests, and local raiding and warfare, which you might call us versus them contests. When people become fused together in that way, any attack on the group is taken personally, and they'll effectively stop at nothing to defend their group against perceived threats and insults, even in extreme cases being willing to fight and die to protect their fellows. In ancient foraging bands, fusion united small groups of people who knew each other personally. Psychologists refer to these as relational groups because they're based on ties between individuals interacting face to face. But as societies grew in scale and complexity, interactions between relative strangers became increasingly important, for example, for the purposes of trade and exchange, or to implement centrally regulated norms and laws. In order for cooperation to operate successfully on such large scales, new forms of group alignment became increasingly important in human affairs, based on categorical rather than relational ties. An example of this is the extensively studied phenomenon of group identification. When we identify with a group category, that is a generic identity like a nation or a world religion, we're not aligning ourselves with people we know personally, but with abstracted persons who are like us by virtue merely of sharing some traits with us. Typically it's beliefs, dialects, norms, customs, rituals, things like that. Identity markers, in other words. Flags are another example. Since these kinds of traits are acquired socially from others rather than being rooted in personal autobiographies, identification is a somewhat depersonalizing kind of way of aligning with the group. In contrast with a fused individual, making the group salient for a highly identified person will make their personal identity less accessible. But this also means that when selfish interests conflict with those of the group, the former may trump the latter, making identification a less effective mechanism than fusion for motivating self-sacrificial behaviours. As groups became larger, identification became increasingly important as a basis for cooperation between strangers. But this also meant that cohesion became more diffuse. For example, whereas warrior bands would fight to the death to protect each other, wars between much larger armies were waged by increasingly professionalized militia, whose cohesion was based on shared symbols and top-down coercion, more than on personally shared experiences or ties of kinship. In the evolution of military cohesion, various solutions have been found to address this basic problem. For example, the division of armies into many smaller relational groups with high levels of identity fusion has allowed military tacticians to harness the most powerful forms of social cohesion among soldiers on the battlefield. But another key development has been the evolution of extended fusion, a form of group alignment in which vast group categories have become associated with some kind of shared essence, capable of driving feelings of fusion. Examples of large-scale group bonding based on beliefs in shared ancestry as in the case of beliefs about race or ethnicity or shared nationality. Those kinds of things extend feelings of psychological kinship to vast populations, leveraging shared physical traits along with myths of descent from common origins. Likewise, extended fusion based on shared experiences utilizes histories of oppression and intergroup conflict associated with categorical groups based on shared religious beliefs or national traits to motivate feelings of patriotism and, in some cases, zealotry. In recent decades, the capacity for extremely large groups to fuse based on shared experiences has been hugely increased as a result of new communications technologies that bring the sufferings of fellow group members onto the screens of our computers and smartphones in ways that are more visceral and bonding than ever before in human history. The evolution of cohesion-building gadgets brings with it a great many dangers, from organised crime and gangland violence to imperial expansionism, and from polarisation and sectarianism to revolutions and genocides. But it also brings with it many opportunities for peaceful cooperation. Although the fusion mechanism evolved to support strong forms of cooperation in small groups of closely related individuals and bands of fictive kin who had endured together the ordeals of tribal initiations or hand-to-hand combat in intergroup raiding parties, recent psychological experiments have shown that perceptions of both shared biology and shared experience can create feelings of fusion on a much, much larger scale than we're used to thinking of it. In fact, it can fuse us together as human beings. Fusion with humanity at large is a realistic prospect for us psychologically. For example, in one experiment, we showed participants a video in which the journalist A.J. Jacobs explained in an intuitively compelling way that all of us are descended from common ancestors, and therefore that all human beings constitute one kind of giant family. By making our shared biology so salient, this video significantly increased levels of fusion with humanity at large among the participants in our study, compared with a control condition in which fusion was measured before rather than after watching the video. The same paper also reported a study showing that globally shared transformative experiences can create fusion that transcends national, ethnic, and religious boundaries. The study showed, for example, that mothers were more fused with other women around the world if they shared motherhood experiences with them. This was building on evidence that we'd had from previous studies that transformative experiences of childbirth provide a potent form of extended fusion capable of creating a sort of extended sisterhood, or a band of mothers, as we called it in the paper. In these studies, whether the key factor was shared ancestry or common experiences, feelings of shared essence and fusion with other human beings around the world were shown to motivate action in the form of money allocations to fellow world citizens. Modern technologies, from TV stations to the internet, provide ever more potent ways of facilitating fusion that could be used to motivate behaviour change to address global challenges. An example of this would be various studies we've carried out in which we present research participants with speeches aimed at encouraging them to donate to charities devoted to action on the climate crisis. We found that simply reminding people of our shared experiences and shared biology as a species may be just as important, if not more important, than persuasion based on scientific evidence when it comes to motivating people to act on the climate crisis. Similar techniques may also contribute to a more peaceful world by supporting efforts to prevent or ameliorate seemingly intractable conflicts. For example, it's been shown that appeals to shared suffering on both sides of a war could improve attitudes towards the outgroup. A case in point is our recent study focusing on responses to the crisis in Gaza, triggered by the Hamas attacks of October 2023, and the relentless Israeli bombardment of the region that followed. In one of these studies, which is currently under review, we recorded a stirring speech that John presented, emphasising the impact of suffering on both sides of that conflict as a basis for building cohesion across the divide. And we found that John's speech had a positive and, interestingly, a lasting impact, because this was a longitudinal study. The effects didn't just go away immediately, the same day. It had a lasting impact on the attitudes of people on both sides of the conflict after listening to it. Actually, I was thinking while listening to Carol and Diora this morning, I couldn't help wondering about the potentially healing effects of making artworks that depict the sufferings, not just of your side, of course, many people would be strongly motivated to do that, but to make artworks that depict suffering on the other side of a conflict. So that, in the same way that sort of being told in a speech about the sufferings on both sides of a conflict, you have an even more visceral sense of it as you create an artwork that depicts the sufferings of the other. To apply those kinds of insights to real-world problems will require effective institutional support. Not only do we need our media and other organs of public information and communication to remind us continually of our shared humanity when it comes to tackling global problems, but we need trusted leaders to shape the public conversation on those kinds of topics. This is very different from a conception of leadership in which, for example, elected politicians seek to reflect public opinion or to exploit it for selfish ends. Instead, we need more leaders who actively shape public opinion in directions that harness our capacities for fusion to support peaceful pro-social outcomes that transcend existing group boundaries. If we're to realise the potential of the new science of the social, and particularly the scientific study of social cohesion, to address global challenges, we really need to act fast. Increasing cohesion within existing global institutions, within institutions like the UN, the ICJ, G20, UNESCO, World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, OECD, there are so many, will require, I think, attention to these core areas of shared ancestry, shared biology, shared experience. These are really fundamental ideas. And we need to get people to sign up to core principles around human rights and SDGs, etc., in a way that makes appeal to these fundamental psychological alignment mechanisms. But we also need to find ways of increasing the salience of global citizenship, not just global governance. We need to emphasize this idea of shared identity among the world's population, increasing the salience and relevance of cohesion with humanity at large as part of a growing movement of worldwide support for global solutions to global problems. The research that I've just been summarizing today suggests that well-crafted speeches from politicians can have more transformative and lasting effects than may be generally appreciated. But that won't be enough. The mass media and public figures of all kinds also have an important role to play in changing the narratives we live by. One of the main challenges will be to create a constructive information environment which reaches beyond the unholy alliance of platform companies and autocrats and their parochial objectives, in which the sale of advertising space in the media is also used to advance populist political agendas. This will involve the creation and widespread dissemination of narratives and practices promoting global cohesion, drawing on state-of-the-art research in fields like experimental psychology and evolutionary anthropology, and building on existing cultural knowledge and traditions. Such narratives and practices should not only respect and celebrate human diversity, but also emphasize the shared humanity of all individuals on the planet, recognizing them as part of a unified global family and community. Such a platform might seek to maximize diversity in terms of human experience, incorporating the perspectives of diverse cultures, including indigenous peoples, independent thinkers, public intellectuals, artists, young people, and also senior politicians and academics. Achieving this will require the development and promotion of an ethical framework for global cohesion, a transparent agenda guided by clear and explicit objectives, along with practical application of these concepts. That would entail the integration of scientific and cultural insights, translating both effectively into tangible political and social actions as part of the art and the development of the arts of communication and implementation. Such efforts to build global cohesion should naturally act as a catalyst for peace, fostering collaboration in addressing global existential challenges and promoting harmonious coexistence among people worldwide. It's crucial to avoid the divisive dichotomies prevalent in today's world in all their us versus them forms, and ensure accessibility across diverse traditions while effectively navigating both digital and offline platforms. Previous attempts to develop international cooperation have typically focused on institutional links, rules and regulations, without much attempt to address the quality of the relationships, or have been based on alliances that are usually formed to oppose other communities that are perceived as a threat. While the latter are represented by bodies like NATO as a defence alliance, the former are exemplified by the UN, which merely requires that a state is recognised by the international community and can therefore nominate its representatives to key positions. This results in states that are gross violators of human rights being elected to chair the human rights organs of the UN, bringing the very notion of human rights into disrepute, and UN mediators being put in place without any of the skills or experience that are appropriate and necessary for the task. Focusing less on institutions and more on relational imperatives would help move the global community towards more cohesive forms of engagement. It's not only the powerful who need to modify their aims and approaches to be less colonial or dominant, but it's also necessary for the less powerful to recognise that they have a vital role to play beyond pointing out the historical and current faults of the more powerful states. This is in recognition that all have their responsibilities in changing things for the better. There's also a need to change the zeitgeist with respect to leadership. In the past, there was an appreciation among people like Gorbachev, Mandela, de Klerk, Clinton, and others that leadership was about resolving conflicts. Most of today's political leaders believe that it's their role to conduct conflicts, not to resolve them. And this is obviously a globally disastrous trend. The problem of academic and cultural silos is also an important one to resolve. Instead of universities bringing together scholars with different approaches to knowledge, humanities, law, medicine, science, technology, they ask for research proposals that tend to be focused on single approaches while reinforcing the boundaries between scholars working in separate departments and faculties, with little understanding of the methods, theories and findings of other disciplines. Consequently, as the collective stock of human knowledge accumulates, it becomes increasingly fragmented rather than cohesive. We need to bring people together, but we also need to bring ideas and perspectives together if we're to address these challenges and potential existential threats. Okay, to sum up, this paper has attempted to bring together the diverse experiences of a small group of leading academics, politicians, activists, and public servants from around the world, focusing on the question how global cohesion can be strengthened to foster international cooperation and mitigate conflict. We need others to join with us to further enrich this vision and shape the public conversation around it. To that end, we invite readers of this article to contact me, the corresponding author on the paper, with their suggestions on how to strengthen global identity and cohesion. Building on that feedback, we'll post online an evolving roadmap for changes to achieve these goals. We'll put this on the website of the Centre for the Study of Social Cohesion. This is just one small step to laying the groundwork for new forms of global cohesion and cooperation. Without such baby steps, we will never progress. But with practice and with the support of other people around us, we know from the study of our evolutionary history that giant strides are indeed possible. So there is hope.